Hey everyone, how's it going? Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm only a couple videos or so away from hopefully firing up the V8 S10 for the first time. If you missed the last episode, I put a link in the description box below. I basically worked on undercoating the cab, changing the body bushings, redoing the firewall, and more. But since then, I also got a bunch of stuff done off camera just to kind of speed things up, and I'll go over those in just a moment. But the focus of today's video is going to be dressing up the 350 small block and installing it back in the truck. Well, the first thing you're probably wondering is why the engine is all taken apart. Well, that was part of the work that I wanted to get done off camera. There was a handful of things that I wanted to do to the engine to kind of refresh it a little bit before it goes back in the truck. Most importantly, I wanted to repaint it because a lot of the paint was chipping off, so I scoured this thing and cleaned it thoroughly, gave it a fresh coat of paint, and it just looks fantastic. I also went through the extra detail to make sure none of the gasket surfaces had paint on it and all that good stuff, so I'm really happy with how it came out. But I also wanted to change out the cork gaskets that were put into the engine, so I got more modern gaskets, got a one-piece oil pan gasket. I had to replace the timing cover because I had to cut off the factory timing indicator to fit the Corvette short water pump, and I went ahead and got a V8 two-wheel drive S10 swap oil pan because while the stock oil pan that was fitted to this engine actually fit pretty good, because of where I'm mounting the engine in the truck, a little further forward than probably some people do, the pan was actually sitting on the cross member, so that should give us pretty good clearance. We'll see how it all lines up, but yeah, now we can really see this thing come together. This is the other major thing I did off camera. I went ahead and completely rebuilt the entire AC heater system. So new heater core, new evaporator core, new blower motor relay, pressure switch, dryer. Literally, it's all new. I redid the cover on this side, basically just sanded it down, coated it in some high temp engine enamel. I scotch brighted the original lines, so that looks really nice. Got some new clamps on there. And on the other side, I went ahead and put on my Hooker high clearance heater box cover that's typically sold for LS swaps, but it's going to be really nice in my case because it'll give me just a little bit more clearance for my valve covers. As far as the little stuff, I went ahead and put on the brake lines because they attach to the cross member and these portions of the frame, so the engine is going to be right in the middle, so that needed to go in first. I also put in the wiper motor and all of the linkages in here. It's all been repainted. There's new hardware. This thing is just looking so nice. But the engine is the main star of this show, so off to my left, got a whole bunch of stuff to put on. There's a whole bunch of stuff to put on that's sitting on those shelves, and even some more stuff on top of the toolbox. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Of course, a special thanks to O'Reilly Auto Parts for supporting the channel. If you're in need of some parts for a project or just general maintenance, check out O'ReillyAuto.com and take advantage of the exclusive discount code SAABKyle20, which gets you 20% off of purchases of $100 or more. I put a link in the description box below. First things first, I want to get this thing sealed up from the bottom, so I'm going to start by installing the new timing cover. The timing indicator is over there. Then I'll turn my attention to the swap oil pan. Now, this thing is pretty cool. Like you saw in the clips I was showing a second ago, the stock pan kind of tapers up gradually as you get towards the back. This one is straight down and straight back, so hopefully it gives a lot of clearance. It's also got a 9.5-inch deep sump, so it offers a greater carrying capacity versus the standard pan. I think this one's about 6 quarts, the standard's around 5 quarts. Because of that, I needed a new oil pickup tube that can actually reach those depths, and I went ahead and got another oil pump while I was at it. So let's start fitting some parts. The reason why I decided to go ahead and replace the oil pump along with the pickup tube is that they're kind of designed to work hand in hand. The biggest differences between the Mylodon setup that I'm using and the factory style setup, which I believe is a milling pump, actually involves where the pickup tube goes into the oil pump. Because of the larger lead-in of the factory style and how it's pressed in, the billet fitting on the Mylodon pickup tube won't fit quite precise enough, and you could get extra vibrations, and depending on, I guess, how the engine is built and driven and whatnot, it could cause premature failure of the part, cracking, breaking, and all of that, which is no bueno. So I just decided to go ahead and replace it all, and because the pan has a deeper sump, you can see how much deeper that pickup tube is going to reach compared to the factory style setup. It even comes with a little brace right here, which just supports everything, which is really nice. If you compare the two pumps also, the Mylodon pump has thicker castings and stuff, so it's a pretty stout setup. Now for the front cover. Obviously I've got the engine upside down still, but this is what we're looking at. I've already installed my crankshaft oil seal. Just took a 46mm socket and a nylon hammer and just gently tapped it in place. But I've got the gasket, got brand new hardware. Now I'm going to put on some high-tech gasket sealant to help keep everything in place. With the front cover in place, I'm going to go ahead and fit the oil pan. Now, this engine originally came with a 4-piece gasket set. You had strips running across each side, as well as little half-moon seals, one of which went across the front cover there, and one that went across right there. Instead of using that 4-piece setup, I actually have a 1-piece rubber gasket, which should seal the engine off even better, especially over the long term. But there still are key areas where RTV is needed, like the little corners right here where the front cover meets up with the block. Same thing with the back, because if it's going to leak, more times than not, it's going to be in those little corners. I may even add some extra RTV in there, you know, just for my own peace of mind. But let's go ahead and start laying down that silicone and get our gasket set. Well, I completely forgot to hit the record button while putting on that gasket, so sorry about that. But as you can see, it's pretty self-explanatory. You just lay the gasket down, make sure it goes in the appropriate grooves, and you're ready to go. I cleaned up some of the extra RTV that oozed out. I got all of the bolt holes lined up, and I added just another real small bead across the top, just where the pan's going to sit, so this thing should set up pretty nice. Wow, this thing is looking awesome. For torquing down the oil pan bolts, I did it in 2 stages. The first stage was about half of the normal torque, working my way from the outside in. The torque is in inch-pounds. And then once all of that was done, I repeated the process and did it to full specification. I also added some RTV to the space in between the front cover and the oil pan, just all the way up in there, and then I just took my finger and smoothed it out. Not necessarily pretty, but it's going to get the job done. Now you can really see the differences from the stock pan, how this one kind of goes up, has a gradual taper, and then rolls back. This one is just very straight edged. You got a flat spot here, goes up, back, and down. The drain plug is at the back. While putting the intake manifold on, I almost forgot to add a couple studs for some stuff I wanted to put on. Like right here, I'm using a set of brace bars, I don't know what you call them, from the 4.3. One's going to attach here, one's going to attach here, and they're both going to connect to here and brace the tensioner bracket assembly. At the back, I added a stud to be able to reuse the throttle cable bracket from the 4.3. So if I remember correctly, it was throttle cable here, TV cable, and cruise control. So the bottom one won't be used, but that saved a little bit of money. Now I'm going to work on reinstalling the water pump, the harmonic balancer, and the block-off plate for the mechanical fuel pump, which would normally be located right there. If you guys remember back in episode 1 when I was just trying to get this truck running, that was before I even considered putting a 350 in it, I replaced the entire fuel system back there, including the sending unit, so all of that stuff is already new and it'd be kind of silly for me to not use it at this point. So I'm going to keep the electric fuel pump, put a regulator somewhere so I can dial back the pressure a bit and make sure it's appropriate for the carburetor. So here's something else that's pretty interesting. The 3 bolts that I already have in the water pump are in what's known as blind holes. They don't go anywhere in particular, but that one on the bottom right actually goes through the water jacket. So I ran down to O'Reilly right quick and grabbed some thread sealant. I'll coat this just like you would coat like Loctite or something like that, but the thread sealant will prevent the coolant from slipping past through the threads, which would eventually cause a leak. At this point, I got the harmonic balancer, the crank pulley, and the water pump pulley affixed to the engine. If you missed the video where I talked about it, I'm actually running an aluminum short water pump off of a late 80s C4 Corvette, reverse rotation, so it'll work with the accessory drive that I have. I'm also running a Mercruiser circulation pump pulley. So the whole reason behind all of this is for radiator and fan clearance, because I'm using doing a traditional puller fan setup instead of a pusher fan. So it is a little tight right here. I've already test fitted the belt and I think it's going to be okay, but it's one of those things, you know, I'll hook it up and see how it goes, but fingers are crossed for sure. If you run into issues with torquing down the crank bolt right here, like when you get close, you might, you know, have the engine rotating and might have a hard time getting it torqued down, I do have a little trick. With the engine on the stand, just thread in 1 or 2 flex plate bolts and wedge a big screwdriver in there, and then as you rotate it, it'll catch on this arm right here and hold it in place so you can get that torque. I went ahead and filled up the engine with oil so I can get some priming out of the way before I get it back in the truck. To do the priming, I actually took an old distributor and removed the gear off of the end after just popping out that little dowel pin. Then I just put it in like normal, because that piece right there drives the oil pump, and these 2 pieces block some sort of passages that I guess allow you to build up enough pressure in there while you're using a drill to, you know, see the oil coming through the push rods and all of that good stuff. So I've already had oil starting to come through, but I still need to crank on it some more, so let's give it a whirl. After after getting everything sufficiently lubed up, I went ahead and put that valve cover setup over there because I was just really excited to see how it was going to look. I'll show you in just a moment. But I also did it a little bit more after the fact, rotating the crank at the same time, just continuing the lube process. You really can't do too much, but everything seems to be looking really awesome at this point, so we can go ahead and close up that side and get this thing back in the truck. All of this needs to be polished up, of course, but man, this looks really good. I've also got that block-off plate set up down there where the mechanical fuel pump used to go. Just a few more last minute things before I get the engine back in the truck. I did want to give you guys a quick heads up that hopefully in the near future I'll start filming a video of wiring up a Dakota digital dashboard for the truck. A while back in the 93 Jimmy Resto series, I wired up a factory digital cluster, which was really cool. It was one of my favorite parts of the truck, but for this I'm doing something a little bit more modern. The Dakota Digital comes with all new sensors and all sorts of stuff, so I think it's going to be a really nice fit and still give off kind of the 80s vibe. That being said, I've already installed a couple of the sensors that came with the Dakota Digital set, including the oil pressure sensor right there and the coolant temperature sensor right there. I've plugged off that hole because it's not going to be used. Everything has the appropriate thread sealer, so we shouldn't have any leaks. I've also got the heater hoses in place. Now, for the thermostat. Now this is exciting. The engine is in the truck. I figured since I already filmed that test fit video a while back that I didn't need to go through the whole reinstallation process. I would just skip all that boring stuff and get right to showing you how it all fits now, because we already kind of had an idea of where everything was going to sit in that test fit video. I knew because I wanted to position the engine further forward that I was going to have to make some core support modifications, so obviously did that in a past video. But now that everything has come together, I got that swap pan on, got the heater box cover on, so much more room was able to be freed up. This thing is fitting like factory. Because of this oil pan, I was able to slide the engine as far forward as the Stealth Conversions mount kit would allow, which positions the back of the engine in the exact same spot as the original 4.3 liter V6 was. So as far as lining up the transmission and reinstalling the drive shaft, it should go together pretty smoothly. I shouldn't have to do any drive shaft modifications, but I do have a new rear end that's going to go in this truck at some point, which might require me to do that, but one thing at a time, obviously. I'm going to climb underneath the truck now and show you the pan. If I had to take a guess, I'd probably say there was between 3/4 and 1.5 inches worth of space between the bottom of the oil pan and the cross member, depending on where you're looking. Since the transmission isn't connected at the moment, the rear of the engine is actually tilting back a little bit, so what you see right here will actually expand quite a bit once the transmission kind of levels things out. So with the back end of the engine drooping a little bit, the front corner of the oil pan is just touching the cross member. Once the engine levels out, like you can see, there's probably going to be about 1/2 inch of space or so, and again, that's with the engine all the way forward. Looking over top of the engine now with this high clearance heater box cover, I now have about 1 inch of space from the valve cover. And thankfully, the HEI distributor still fits perfect. I'll end up installing the headers in the steering system rebuild video, which I think I may have mentioned it sometime in the last couple episodes, but that video will be the next episode because the steering shaft goes through the headers on this side, and I figured I would just do all of that at once. Also, sometime this weekend off camera, I'm going to be retest fitting the core support. Even though I was able to free up a ton of space with this Corvette water pump and the Mercruiser pulley, I did slide the engine forward just a little bit more, so I want to double check all of that before I really start going for final assembly. Before I close the video out, I still want to install the accessory brackets because that will make the engine look even more complete, and I just really want to see it. Plus, it'll give me a chance to show you guys the modifications that I had to do to the AC compressor bracket, because the lower radiator hose and the heater hose sit a lot closer to the engine with the short pump, so had to make some modifications. The accessory drive setup that I'm using, for the most part, is the same as the setup that was originally on the 4.3 liter V6 that came out of this truck. It is, for all intents and purposes, a direct bolt-on to a 350, with the exception of two things. I had to get an 8-inch harmonic balancer, and of course I have the different water pump and pulley setup. But because of this, some modifications needed to be done to this, and if you hadn't noticed it already, I'll consider that a compliment because I think I did a pretty good job. So because the water pump sits so much closer to the engine, the lower radiator hose is right in the way of the bracket. So is the heater hose. Normally that stuff would be over here. So I had to cut a big section out of the middle, which I didn't really want to do, but to be able to use this, you got to get a little creative. That being said, since I took so much metal out of there, I fashioned up a couple of brackets that go in the original holes where a smog pump would have been. My truck didn't have it, but it still had the provision for it. So I used this same, hole that attaches the bracket to the block and just drilled a hole for my bracket, and I used the other 3 holes for the smog pump. So this thing is wicked strong. Here's another look at everything from the front side of the engine. There is plenty of clearance for everything. The only downside, if you can really call it a downside, to doing it like this is that first of all, I didn't want to cut out too much metal out of this bottom section. So getting this lower radiator hose on is a little tricky. It fits, it's just really tight. You basically have to go under and up and just shimmy it for a while. So the radiator hose will end up resting on this little valley. It doesn't hit this, it doesn't hit this like the raised portions. It just gently lays there and comes out. It doesn't pinch or anything like that. It flattens a little bit, but it widens, so I don't think it's going to impede flow or anything like that. But just like anything else with a project where you're doing custom stuff, time will tell, but I'm really happy with how this turned out. The last thing I want to address with this bracket is the fact that there is not a threaded hole right here, right there, so I can't bolt the bracket to the head like I could in the 4.3. So instead, I touched on this earlier as to why I was putting in that stud. I'm taking a couple brackets off of the 4.3 which connect back behind the tensioner assembly right here, and just amazingly, the 2 provisions right here line up exactly like the original setup did. So this is going to be extra strong. That right there is not even going to matter, especially with everything else being taken care of. I am very, very happy with this. Well, everyone, that's going to wrap it up for this video. I hope y'all enjoyed. Please don't forget to leave a like below. It really helps the video a lot. And if you haven't subscribed already, consider doing so, because there's a lot more content where that came from. Also, a big thanks once again to O'Reilly Auto Parts for all of their support. Don't forget to check out O'ReillyAuto.com for all of your parts needs, and take advantage of the exclusive discount code SOBKyle20. I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care.